Okay, I think we can start. um, I hope you guys can see my screen and hear me well. I am sharing, right? Okay. Yeah. Um, yeah. So this lecture was basically about activation functions and loss functions. Yeah, not much discussion about any architectures or models or anything like that. Just yeah, he just lists down all the activation functions and loss functions that are available in PyTorch. When I mean the advantages of each of them, the disadvantages, which one is suitable for what type of architecture, and yeah, and also at the end, loss functions specific to energy based models. um, yeah, that's pretty much what he includes in this lecture. So let's dive right in. So the first one is the most popular one, arguably. It's ReLU. I think all of you are familiar with it. This is the most, I mean, this is what being used in most architectures these days. It's just the max of zero comma x. So it's the most simple non-linearity that you can have. Yeah, just a single kink. So 0 if it's negative, and the value of x, y is equal to x for if it's a positive value. um, yeah, and then there are a bunch of variations of ReLU, which where this bottom part is not constant. So that's the only difference. The right part is, I think it's always y is equal to x. So they have just done some modifications to this part where they have not made it constant. So those are the variations of ReLU. So this part can have a positive or negative slope, or I think some smooth ones are also there. um so yeah, the first one is random ReLU, where this part has a slope which is ax. So the slope is a, and I think, yeah, for random ReLU, a is a random variable that keeps samplings in a given range during training and remains fixed during testing. Yeah, I've, like most of the functions here, I have not seen them being used anywhere. And I guess uh, maybe a provides some sort of regularization. I could be wrong, but maybe it does that. Yeah, it's, I guess, yeah, it's kind of tricky, because if the behavior keeps changing, then I'm not sure how it exactly learns proper weights, given that a keeps changing. But yeah, that's what our ReLU is. um, then you have,
It might be functioning like dropout, kind of, right? Because it's random and
mhm,
dropping out the negative signal, right, during training uh, randomly.
so it's like regularization, right? I mean, it
Yes,
provides
I think so.
regularization.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
But
Okay.
Sujit, why do you say it drops out, right? It actually, the
Changes. Yes.
zero,
Yeah.
it changes it and actually allows it in the outputs, because a proper ReLU doesn't even let anything which is negative go through. But in this
Right.
case, it allows it to get through, which, if I recall correctly, says it's more for a faster convergence rather than
Okay.
a dropout or regularization. If it's more like training, that's the reason it's used only in training and not in inference, right? At inference at time, it's fixed.
I see. Okay.
So I thought it was more to do with the convergence and training speed than regularization effects.
All right. That's good. Yeah. Thank you, Srinivas. Thanks.
Yep. Thanks, Srinivas. Um, Next we come to leaky ReLU, which has a fixed negative slope, is usually very small, I think. So you can see it's just slightly below zero. If we can zoom in, I mean, well into this, it's just slightly below zero. A is a fixed parameter. It prevents the problem of dying ReLU, which is when the ReLU neurons become inactive and only output 0 for any input. Yeah, so when the gradient is just 0, no output, no gradient. I mean, when the value is here is negative, no gradient flows because the slope at the negative region is 0. So there is no learning that happens and the neuron just dies. So to avoid that, you have a small slope in the negative region. So apparently this is not much of a problem when your network is large, when there are many layers. So leaky ReLU is necessary for skinny network when it's impossible to get gradients flowing with a normal ReLU. So like I said, yeah, the gradients can still flow even when everything is zeroed out because of negative values.
This could be some like similar to what Srinivas said for the random ReLU as well, right? It's basically preventing that flattening, like what's that called, asymptoting, and then everything dies, right? So
any
vanishing,
intuition
yes.
why smaller networks are more prone to dying ReLU?
Is it longer? Or sure.
Smaller ones are more prone to dying neurons. Sorry,
Okay.
yeah, dying. So leaky ReLU is more necessary for skinny networks to get the gradients flowing back.
Skinny in the sense of long, right? Long and not wide, or longer compared to its width. So that I can figure out because it's vanishing gradients, right?
Okay. So you're saying skinny means long ones.
I think, I'm not sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
But you never see leaky ReLU, right? Even in huge networks.
Yeah, I haven't, but my experience is not that much.
Okay. Yeah, this point was not clear even in the lecture. I think Alfredo was the one who mentioned it. He said skinny networks, leaky ReLU is useful. Okay. Yeah, if anyone else knows about this, please jump in. Yeah, P ReLU, I don't know what P stands for. The A is a learnable parameter. Yeah, I think I'm not sure. Okay, yeah, I think it comes below. So he talks about the learning of A as well. The above activation functions are scale invariant. So what this means is if you multiply your input signal by 2, the output signal also gets multiplied by 2. I think that's what it means. So it's yeah, since it just has a single kink. So what it means is the behavior of the activation function does not depend on the scale of your input. So you can multiply or divide your input by 100,000, whatever. The behavior will remain the same since it's just a simple kink nonlinearity. If it was curved, it would depend on the signal. I think we'll come to that later as well.
Yeah, one comment here, Gautam, is I think late in the lecture he later corrects himself, and it's kind of sad they didn't fix it in the notes. It's scale equivariant, which means that because scale invariant should technically mean that it doesn't change with scale, but that's not per se what happens. It does change with scale. It's just that the behavior of the network doesn't change. So it's then, at least in the lecture, he corrects himself to say it's scale equivariant. So I don't know.
But
makes sense.
I thought the same, but it could also mean the behavior of the activation function, right? The behavior is scale invariant. Maybe that's what he meant. Yeah. Soft plus. Okay, soft plus is a smooth approximation to the ReLU function. It can be used to constrain the output of a machine to be always positive. Yeah, it's basically differentiable ReLU. I think that's what he mentioned in the lecture. And the larger your beta is, the more it resembles a ReLU. So it's asymptotically y is equal to x in the positive side and asymptotically 0 as you go to the negative side. Next is LU, ELU. So this is again a soft version of ReLU. It's just ReLU and we are adding a small quantity to ReLU to make it a smooth function. So this allows the model to it allows the unit to have negative values, and there is an advantage to that. So when your unit has both negative and positive values, it can allow the input to have or the output actually to have a zero average. So this is advantageous for the weights in the following layer, in the next layer. So if the weights in the layer is seeing an input of average 0, that allows faster convergence. So this is essentially what batch normalization also does, right? It makes your input to have 0 mean. So that's the advantage. If your activation is giving both positive and negative values, it can allow the average output to be 0, which allows for faster convergence. Then a bunch of activation functions which he did not talk about much. They are just slightly modified versions of this. CellU, X pi alpha, then SELU. I think, I'm not sure, but I think BERT uses one of these somewhere, but I just have a faint memory of seeing one of these in BERT, but I don't remember which one. GLU, cumulative distribution function for Gaussian distribution. This is ReLU 6, which again I have not seen before. So it has two non-linearities. I mean, two kinks basically. This is ReLU saturating at 6, but there is no particular reason for picking 6 as saturation. Yeah, he also does not explain where this is used or yeah. I don't know why they just named the function as ReLU 6. I mean, they could have just kept it 6 as a parameter if 6 is not I mean, if there is no speciality to 6, they could have kept that as a parameter. But I don't know, maybe there's something special with 6. Yeah, then sigmoid. This is just a really zoomed out sigmoid. So it's used to get something between 0 and 1, something that can like simulate our probability. So we don't usually use sigmoid in the middle layers, because if we stack sigmoid in many layers, it may be inefficient for the system to learn and requires careful initialization. Because if the input is very large or very small, your gradient is essentially 0. So there's no gradient flowing back. So when you take, so what happens is when you take the gradient of the loss function and then you do back propagation, come back, and then when you take the gradient of this sigmoid, if it's large or really small, your gradient is 0. I mean, close to 0. So there's your model won't learn as well because the gradient is so small. So the weight updates won't happen properly. In this case, there is no gradient flowing back to update the parameters. So this is saturating gradient. I think it's also called vanishing gradient. Yeah, so this is an important point. For deep neural networks, a single kink function such as ReLU is preferred. Because yeah, the gradient flows better. Tan H is identical to sigmoid except it's centered, ranging from, so here it's 0 to 1, here it's -1 to +1. So the output will have a roughly 0 mean. And like I said earlier, anything that gives negative and positive values, it's good for model convergence. Yes, that's what it says here. Note that convergence is usually faster if the average of each input variable is close to 0. So the input here means the input to the next layer, the layer following this activation. Yeah, and this is what is done in batch normalization. Soft sign is similar to sigmoid, but its asymptotes slightly slower. So it's, yeah, it doesn't flatten as quickly as sigmoid. So it alleviates the gradient vanishing problem to some extent, not completely. Hard tan H. Hard tan H looks like tan H, but it's hard as it says in the title. So yeah, it's -1 if it's less than -1, if it's 1 if greater than 1, and just X otherwise. Yeah, again, this would work well if the weights are in the small range. Otherwise, I guess it's a vanishing gradient problem. But I don't know why you would use this anyway. Threshold is the old style of activations. If your value crosses a threshold, you take that value, which is X. Otherwise, you take a default V. So yeah, this, since people were using this type of activation function, there is no gradient here, right? I mean, so that's why this prevented people from using backpropagation in the 60s and 70s. Yeah, so this was what prevented them from using backpropagation. Tan H shrink. So these activation functions are not used in neural networks. So what he said was in the lecture was it's used for sparse coding to compute the value of the latent variable. I don't know too much about that, so yeah, I mean, I can't explain too much about that. So it's not used in neural networks, but it is used for this purpose, sparse coding to compute the value of the latent variable. If anyone knows about this, please do. We can talk about that. So soft shrink, it just shrinks the variable by a constant towards 0. So it just reduces the value of the input signal by a constant, which is lambda. If it is a positive, I mean, if it's greater than lambda, and this, if it's a negative value less than minus lambda, it just adds a lambda. So it just constricts or reduces the value of the input signal and forces it towards 0. You can think of it as a step gradient for the L1 criteria. Yeah, it's again not used in common neural network as activations. Hard shrink is again the same. It's not used in neural networks. It's used in sparse coding for the latent variables. Log sigmoid, it's not used in as an activation function in the middle layers. It's used in the last layer as a loss function. So it's just log of the sigmoid.
One point about the sparse coding.
Yeah.
I think I don't know, but if you look at this one here, yeah, the one figure 17, right? So I think what it does is it takes low values, and basically zeroizes them. So essentially, it's like if you have a graph, or and you have low edge weights and it's very dense. If you remove the low edge weights, it becomes a little sparser, so it's easier to work with. It might be that. I'm not sure. I mean, this is just something like, when I looked at the graph, it kind of came to an idea. So, yeah.
Did you say low edge weights?
Yeah. So if you think of a graph, right, and you have these nodes connected by edges, right, and each of the edges have some kind of weight. So, and if it looks like a big hairball, the one approach is basically you take, all the low edge weights and you remove them, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, and you get a sparser graph which contains all the important relations.
Okay.
And basically, so that is graph sparsification. I don't know if that actually has a relation with latent
Okay.
sparsification, but that's kind of something that occurred to me, so I wanted to share it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, sure.
Then there's soft min. So this is same as softmax, but with a negative in front of x. So what he says in the lecture is, if your x's are energies, or if you consider them as some kind of penalty, then you have this. So usually the x is kind of a score for your class, right? So if it's a energy or if it's a penalty, then you can use soft min. You just add a negative in front of the x. Softmax is something that's familiar to all of us. Yeah, to get a 0 to 1 score for a bunch of classes. So sigmoid you use when you have just binary, and softmax you use for C classes. I mean, yeah. Log softmax is just log log on top of softmax. Yeah. Then there are a bunch of questions that they asked in the lecture. Why would we want same value of A for all channels? Where you could have different A. A is the slope for the negative side of the graph. So what it says is you could use A as a parameter of every unit. It could be shared as a feature map as well. Yeah, different channels could have different A. Okay. Do we learn A? Is learning A advantages? You can learn A or fix it. The reason for fixing it is to ensure that nonlinearity gives you a non-zero gradient even if it's in a negative region. Okay, I think there are advantages for both fixing it and making it learnable. For certain specific purposes, making A learnable is useful. So it can learn to be a linear mapping or a full rectification. Full rectification is when you have absolute value of x. So your A can basically be learned to do something like that, and that is particularly useful for edge detector. Okay, how complex do your nonlinearity do you want your nonlinearity to be? So what he says here is, you can make your nonlinearity very complex, but what helps is just a simple nonlinearity, like a small kink. That's what I mean. That is usually, I mean, that is enough and sufficient for your model to learn well. Yeah, monotonic nonlinearity will work better. In short, you can parameterize any functions. You can make it as complex as you want, but it does not give you a huge advantage. So essentially what you want is a simple nonlinearity between layers. uh, I think even the theorem that neural networks are based on, which is universal approximation theorem, it just says that there should be nonlinearity between matrix multiplications, right? That's all it's needed to learn any type of function. You don't need complex activation functions. Kink related questions. One kink is double kink. So double kink has a built-in scale in it. If the input layer is multiplied by 2, or the signal amplitude is multiplied by 2, the outputs will be completely different. So signal will be more in nonlinearity, thus you will get a different behavior of the output. So this is what I said earlier. If your activation function has multiple kinks, it is scale variant. The behavior of the activation function depends on the scale of your signal, which is not a good thing. I think he comes to that as well. The reasoning behind that. The next question was, do we prefer having kinks or a smooth nonlinear activation? So what he says in this section is, if you have something like that, yeah, something like this one. So if your input signal is like multiplied by 100, you have, so your activation function is pretty much like a behaves like a hard kink. It just what it sees is an activation function which behaves like a hard kink. But if you divide it by 100, then it sees something like a smooth uh, curve. So the behavior of the activation function depends on the the scale of your signal. I think that's what he says. uh, yeah. If you multiply the input by 100, the output looks like you have a hard kink, because the smooth part is shrunk by a factor of 100. If you divide the input by 100, the kink becomes a very smooth convex function. I think that's understandable, right? Thus, by changing the scale of the input, you change the behavior of the activation unit. So, and what the implication of this is that your weights are not free now, because the weights of the previous layer, that is, because the weight is now also affecting the behavior of the activation function, right? So I think he talks about that here as well. Yeah, I think it's here. You don't have a control of how big the weights of one layer is in relative to the other layer's weights. So if you have a nonlinearity that cares about scales, your network does not have a choice of what weight matrix can be used in the first layer, because this will completely change the behavior of in the activation function in the next layer. So uh, having a that is why having a kink is better than having scales. I mean having a smooth curve in your activation function. And at the end of that, all of that, he says it's not clear why deep networks work better with single kink functions. He says it's probably due to the what I just said, the scale equivariance property. Okay. Temperature coefficient. Yeah, someone asked about temperature coefficient of that's used in soft max. So temperature is redundant with the incoming weights. If you have weighted sums coming into your soft max, the beta parameter is redundant with the size of the weights. Okay. Temperature controls how hard the distribution of outputs will be. Okay, it's just I think it controls the contrast that you get between classes in the output of the softmax. When beta is very large, it becomes very close to either 1 or 0. When beta is small, it is softer. Okay. Next we come to loss functions. MSE loss is the common one that we use for continuous outputs. It's the squared L2 norm. So X is a vector, target Y is also a vector of numbers. We just take the squared L2 norm between each element in X and the target Y. And then, yeah, you can just reduce it. I mean, by either taking a mean or a sum, or you can leave it like that. Yeah. L1 loss is basically the mean absolute error between the input and the output vector. Yeah, mod of xn minus yn, the nth element of x vector and the nth element of the target vector. And again, you can add it or take a mean. And yeah, one important point he says here is L1 loss is used for robust regression. So in L1 loss, the small errors, you use L1 loss when you want the small errors to count or to count a lot, and when your model is slightly noisy or has some outliers, those don't matter as much. So in L2 loss, since you're taking square of the errors, small errors become even smaller when they're less than 1. In L1 loss, they count as much. I mean, since you are not taking a square. And then if you have outliers or some noise and you have very large errors, when you take square of that, they become even larger. So in L1 loss, this is like a protection against that. Yeah, so in L2, what happens is the cost function gets very sensitive to outliers, which is not something that we want. Yeah. So L1 loss is not differentiable at the bottom. So we have something like we have a kink usually. So we need to be careful when handling its gradients, namely soft shrink. So he relates the soft shrink that we saw earlier with this. I'm not sure exactly how that works when handling its gradients, namely soft shrink. This motivates a smooth L1 loss. Let me just see if I can. Does anyone know the relation between soft shrink and L1 loss? It's also one of the, I mean, you can think of it as a step of gradient for the L1 criteria.
So I think if you're very close to 0 here, your output is also going to be 0. So then you'll have to, your loss will also be 0. X is 0, Y is 0. Therefore, the mod of X and Y is also 0. And then at that point, it is not differentiable because it's a discontinuity, right? So I think that's what he's talking about, and that motivates the smooth L1 loss later in the
So do we apply this activation when we want to do an L1 loss?
No, I think he's saying in cases where soft shrink is the activation function, L1 loss can have issues, right? So that's what I got from it, but maybe I'm wrong.
Okay. Okay. So smooth L1 loss solves this problem. It uses L2 near 0 yeah, if the error is less than 1, we use L2 loss, and for far away losses we use L1 loss. This was used in fast RCNN. It's also called the Huber loss. It is less sensitive to outliers because it uses L1 loss for large losses, and it's smooth at the bottom. This function is used in computer vision for protecting against outliers. Okay, this has a scale, which, as we saw, has issues of its own. Yeah, this is something interesting that Alfredo asked. So what he asked was, when you use L2 loss, it results in a blurry image, and when you use L1 loss, it's not blurry. So what Jan said was, for minimizing L2 loss, the output that we get is an average of all the y's, and you know that average of, suppose you have an image of many cats, an average image of all cats will just be a blurry mess. It won't look like a cat at all. But to minimize the L1 loss, what we take is the median. I don't know why you wrote medium. I think it's supposed to be median. The median is actually a real data point, right? So it won't be blurry. So I think this is a very simplistic explanation, but still, it makes intuitive sense, because usually we have so many dimensions. This is negative log likelihood loss. So you use this when you have a classification problem with multiple classes. So you have an X vector with uh, X scores, I mean, X vector with C scores, each corresponding to uh, a particular category. Like you have, I don't know, something like ImageNet. So each class would have its own score, and the motive is to increase the score of the uh, correct class. So that is what NLL loss is basically. Yeah, we just want to increase the correct component of the X vector. I mean, make it as large as possible, because that is the score of the correct category. Uh, 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 uh. And then you can have weights when you have an imbalanced data set. When you have, yeah, when you have, when the frequency of few classes are much higher than the frequency of other classes. And so Jan had a lot to say in this particular section. So what he says is, he's he does not agree. I mean, he does not think that using weights is a very great idea. What he says is, it's better to equalize the frequency in training, and this can exploit stochastic gradients better. So he explains this in the video well. What he says is, yeah, you just, when you create the batches, you just equalize the frequency by, I think what he does is oversampling. So you do oversampling to get equal frequencies of all the classes, and you should never do undersampling, because undersampling essentially means you are just throwing away some data points in the majority class. That is obviously not recommended. So when you use, yeah, what he recommends is oversampling. And so the reason that reason that is useful is, the system is the system just develops good features for all the classes, including the rare ones. Yeah. And one problem with this is that, the so once you train your model with equal frequencies, that may not reflect the real life scenario, right? So the example that he gives is uh, common cold and lung cancer. So lung, we know that common cold is much more frequent than lung cancer. But while training, we give equal examples of both. But at the end, the neural network should know the relative frequency of the occurrence. I mean, the actual occurrence probability of both. So to do that, what he says is we should fine tune the system again by running a few epochs with the actual class frequency. So the once the system has actually learned good features for predicting both, I mean all the classes, after that you fine tune the system by running a few epochs with the actual frequency, so that the system adapts the biases at the output layer. So the biases at the output layer have to reflect the actual class frequencies. Again, this is something that I have not heard before, but it seems really interesting. So you fine tune with the actual frequencies of the classes. Yeah, he gives a medical school example as well. If you have rare diseases and common diseases, the students spend uh, like equal time on studying both types of diseases, but at the end they adapt themselves to the common ones. Okay. Next is cross entropy, which combines uh, log softmax and NLL loss. So one thing that I did not mention is okay, no, yeah, log softmax and NLL loss. The combination of the two makes the score of the correct class as large as possible. Okay. So here we merge log softmax and NLL loss to get for numerical stability. So what happens is if you do softmax separately and then NL loss, sometimes you can have gradient issues. So yeah, the reasoning is given here. When the value after softmax is close to 1 or 0, um, yeah, so softmax will give you something from 0 to 1, right? If the value is close to 1 or 0, the log of that can get close to 0 or negative infinity. So log of 0 is negative infinity, and when the slope of log close to 0 is close to infinity, and yeah, what this happens is the intermediate step in back propagation can have numerical issues. So that's why you combine log softmax so that you don't face this gradient issue. Yep, I hope that made sense. Normalized score. The input is explicitly unnormalized score for each class. Yep.
Basically, log squashes the scale, right? So it takes the vanishing and exploding parts back, puts them in a smaller.
Or can you repeat that?
So I think of log as kind of squashing the scale, right? So very small numbers will still have some kind of negative log something, right? And very large numbers will still have some kind of positive log something, but much smaller. So if you have like 1 million, log of 1 million is 7, right? So in that sense.
Okay, so that's the reason why we take log after softmax, right? That's
I
what you
think
said.
so, yeah.
Okay.
Very small and very large numbers.
Okay. Mm, uh, so yeah, what you do in cross entropy is you are just comparing the distributions, right? So you have an x vector which is the score of for each class, and your y vector is basically 1 for the correct class and 0 everywhere else, and you're just finding the distance between these two distributions, and that is essentially your loss, and you're trying to reduce that or minimize that. Yep. Adaptive log softmax is when you have large number of classes, like millions of classes. It implements tricks to solve the speed of computation. So what he said was, we ignore classes that have really low scores, but that's all he said in this loss function. Yep. Let's move on to the next. Okay. Binary cross entropy is just a special case of cross entropy when you have just two categories. Um, Kullback Leibler divergence. Okay, one thing that I forgot to mention is the binary cross entropy assumes that x and y are probabilities, so that they are strictly between 0 and 1. So you should already have taken sigmoid of the values before you feed it into this particular loss function, BCE loss. Kullback-Leibler divergence is, yeah, I don't know much about this one. Simple loss function for when your target is one hot distribution. It's the same thing, I guess. It's just comparing the distributions. It assumes x and y are probabilities. It has the advantage that it is not merged with softmax or log softmax, so it may have numerical stability issues. So here you have to take softmax separately and then take this loss. So it may have numerical stability issues. So BC loss with logits. So this is essentially the same as this, but you don't have to do the sigmoid beforehand or softmax beforehand. You can just directly feed the logits or the scores for each category to this loss. You don't have to take a sigmoid in between. This is more numerically stable. Does not assume that x is between 0 and 1. So I think this numerical stability basically means that gradients don't, there are no gradient problems. But then I think people still use BCE loss by taking sigmoids manually, especially in TensorFlow. I think people directly use sigmoid and then this. So I'm not sure how common the gradient problem is. Okay. So margin ranking loss. These are a separate category of losses in itself. So essentially what it says is, if you have like two inputs, it wants the it wants the input of the correct category to be larger than the other one by at least a margin. So yeah, I think if you look at this carefully, it makes intuitive sense. So if your difference between x1 and x2 is equal to the margin, then your loss is 0. And y just tells you which one of these should be larger. I think that's what it means. So y is either -1 or 1. So if you want x1 to be larger, y takes a particular value. If you want x2 to be larger, then y is the other value. If you were to use this for classification, you would have x1 be the score of the correct answer and x2 the score of the highest scoring incorrect answer in the mini batch. Okay, so you have, so x is always a vector, right? A vector that's whose length is equal to the number of classes you have. I mean, in that's in a yeah, in a discrete, I mean, in a classification context. So x1 is the score of the correct answer, and you want x1 to be high because it's the score of the correct answer, and x2 is the score of the highest scoring incorrect answer. So you take the score which is highest and wrong, and you want x1 to be greater than x2 by at least a margin, and your loss function is based on that. So uh, yeah, so if x2 is larger, your loss will be higher, and if x1 is greater than x2 by margin, then your loss is 0. And this is also used in energy based functions, which we will be looking at later. Next is triplet margin loss. This is used for measuring a relative similarity between samples. So if I'm correct, this is used in contrastive learning. Okay, so what? So you have a CNN. Okay, I'll just read this. So for example, you put two images through with the same category through a CNN, and you get vectors. So you have a CNN, and you put in an image through the CNN, and you get encoding of that image, which is just a vector. And suppose you have two images which represent the same category. You want the encoding or the embedding or the vector that represents these two images to be as close as possible. So you want the distance between those two vectors to be as small as possible. And if you want two images with different categories, if you put two images with different categories of CNN, you want the distance between those two vectors to be as large as possible. So that's when you use triplet margin loss. So this reminds me of a competition that we did in the Kaggle group, which is the Cora question pair similarity. So there we had two questions which could either mean the same, which could either have the same semantic meaning or they mean different things. So if they mean the same thing, you want the embedding that represents question 1 and question 2 to be close. And if the two questions mean different things, that is if the label is 0 or 1. So if the 0, if the questions mean different things, you want the embedding of question 1 and question 2 to be as far as possible. So in such a scenario, you can use triplet margin loss. The loss function tries to send. Okay, so you have something called an anchor sample, and then you have positive sample and a negative sample. So let's assume your anchor sample is cat. I think this is the example he took in the lecture. So A is the image of a cat, and P is also a cat, and N is a table. So you want so D represents the distance measure. This could be it could be Euclidean, but usually we don't take Euclidean. It's something like cosine loss, I think, cosine embedding loss. So the distance between two cat images should be less than the distance between a cat image and a table image by at least a margin. That's what this loss means. The Yeah, let's just read this. The loss function tries to send the first distance towards 0 and the second distance larger than some margin. That makes sense. The only thing that matters is that the distance between the good pair is smaller than the distance between the bad pair by a margin. Mm. Yep. The only thing that's not explained here is how do you just pick the samples? Are they just picked randomly, or
Usually, so at least for one example I know of, where you take an image, the anchor, and then you augment the image in some way, right? So by some sharing or zooming in or whatever, and you consider that as the positive, right? And then you take another random image from your collection and consider that as a negative, and you try to maximize triplet loss in this way.
okay, that makes sense. Random, which is not belonging to the same class, right?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. If you have access to class. If you don't, then you just pick random. But again, like you said, same class is always better.
This was originally used to train an image search system for Google. At that time, you would type a query into Google and it would encode that query into a vector. It would then compare that vector to a bunch of vectors from images that were previously indexed. Google would then retrieve the images that were previously indexed. Okay. Yep, that makes sense. Soft margin loss. Creates a criterion that optimizes a two-class logistic loss between input tensor X and a target tensor containing. I don't think he talked about this in the lecture, so I don't remember this. Input tensor X and a target tensor Y containing 1 or -1. Okay. It's a softmax version of a margin loss. Okay. Multi-class hinge loss. This margin base allows for different inputs to have different amount of targets. Okay, I think what this means is okay, it's multi-label. Yeah, when the same image can have multiple labels. Hinge embedding loss. This LaTeX has not rendered properly. Okay, it's just the L1 pairwise distance of X. Okay, it's just the distance measure between two vectors by taking the L1 pairwise distance between the two vectors. Cosine embedding loss. The cosine embedding loss is again used in Siamese nets. Yeah, in Siamese nets to compute the similarity between two vectors. So one way of doing a similarity measurement is just taking Euclidean loss, but as he mentioned in the lecture, a simple hack to increase the Euclidean loss is just to make your vectors really, really long. So when you have really long vectors, the distance between them is just made artificially large. So that is not what we want. What we want is to make the vectors point in different directions, right? So that is why we take cosine embedding loss as a measure of the distance between two vectors. So the loss is 1 minus cosine of x1, x2. So this is the angle, I guess, the angle between x1, x2.
And cosine already has on the denominator, it has the norm of the two vectors, right? So if you do x dot y divided by norm of x, norm of y, right? So the norm of x and norm of y acts as that, the length becomes effectively 1 for both.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. He even refers to this as normalized Euclidean distance. That's
Yeah,
what he
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So for positive cases, what this achieves is it makes the vectors aligned in the same direction, and the negative cases it tries to bring them apart. Like at least by this margin. Okay. CTC loss. This was slightly complicated, and he took a bunch of time explaining that. CTC loss. So the example that he gave in the lecture was speech recognition. So your output is, so in speech recognition your output is a sequence of vectors of scores. So suppose the example that he gives is someone uttering the word 7. So when you say the word 7, uh, uh, okay, what's the right word for that? You have syllables in them, right? I think it's called phonemes, maybe. So you have a bunch of individual sounds in while uttering a word. Um, and in a sound input, you have classes for each frames at each bunch, each maybe, yeah, there's some time interval, I guess. So you have labels for each 10 milliseconds or so, a bunch of frames together. And so the output so the input may have a bunch of, so suppose the word being uttered is 7. So the first 10 frames of the first 10 labels may have the label S. The next few labels may have the label E. So I don't think there are labels for each letter, but you get the point. But the problem here is sometimes someone may utter the word 7 in a really slow manner. So sometimes you have uh, like the first 20 labels as S, and sometimes you may have only the first 5 labels as S and the next few labels as E or so. So the so the so this loss just takes care of that basically. So your input can have uh, variable length. Okay, better I just read it instead of confusing. CTC loss sums over the probability of possible alignments of input to target, producing a loss value which is differentiable with respect to each node. The alignment of input to target is assumed to be many to one. So that's what I meant. So when you say the word 7, there are multiple syllables in it, right? And sometimes one person may stretch the first syllable for a longer time. Uh, Sometimes it's stretched to a shorter time and so on. But your output vector is your output vector is just the vectors of, I mean, it's just one, right? The sounds of each syllable. So that's why it says this loss takes care of this many to one concept, which limits the length of target sequence such that it must be less than or equal to the input length. Useful when your output is a sequence of vectors which is correspond to scores of categories. Okay, I'll just read this as well. Predict what is being pronounced every 10 milliseconds. So this is the interval I was talking about. Each word is represented by a sequence of sounds, which I think they are the phonemes maybe. Depends on person speaking speed. Different length of the sound might be mapped to the same word. Yep. find the best mapping from the input sequence to the output sequence. A good method for this is using dynamic programming to find the minimum cost path. So the output sequence is just 7, and the input sequence, it can be like arbitrarily long depending on how the person is speaking it. And the loss is basically low. I mean, they find the shortest path in this. So this matrix is, I think, just a similarity score between the input sequence and the output sequence. And to find the actual sequence that is spoken here, they use dynamic programming to find the shortest path through the high similarity score areas. And then if that sequence is the same as this sequence, your loss is low. Yeah, I think that's how this connectionist temporal classification loss works. Yeah, it's, I mean, this is one of those things that if you're actually implementing it, you'll understand it much better than just like learning it theoretically. Yep. Next, we move to energy-based models. Okay. So in energy-based models, so in energy-based models, as we have learned it in previous lectures, what you want is, what you're trying to do is like make an energy function which has low energy on actual data points and high energy elsewhere. And so your training is essentially to build that energy function. That is what you do in your training step. So your training set is the set of the x and y's for I ranging from I to p. So p is the number of samples that you have, and x is your input and y is the corresponding output. And then you have a family of energy functions which is parameterized by w. So energy function is it's parameterized by these weights, and your aim is to get low energy function score for x and its corresponding y, and the things that you are allowed to change are these weights. So these are the family of energy functions. And your loss function here is a function of your training set and your energy function. So there are two things. So there's loss functional and loss function. So functional means a function of a function. So here loss is a function of E, which is a function in itself, right? So you can either use the loss functional or you can use the loss function, which is L of Ws, because E in itself is parameterized by W. So you can just write it as LWS. Yeah, so you can use either this or this. They are the same thing. I hope that made sense. So this measures the quality of an energy function on a training set. Invariant under permutations and repetitions of the sample. Okay. So right now the question is like, what kind of loss function can you have which can ultimately give you low energy at the data points and high energy everywhere else. So that is the question that we have. Okay, if you consider the loss functional, the per sample loss is a function of the yi, which is the sample data point, the sample target or the y value, and the energy function. The energy function values at all y's, all possible y's. So yi is the desired answer, can be a category or a whole image. So eyx is the energy surface for given xi as y varies. Okay, I hope this part made sense. So this is the energy surface, and this is the actual y value, and the loss should be high. I mean, the energy function's value should be high at yi and low. I mean, low at yi and high at all other y's. So ey. So this is the energy surface for given x as y varies. I think this may be better explained from the image if I have it. Okay, I don't have this here. I'll just quickly download it. Okay, I think I closed that window. Just give me a second. So if you assume a particular x and then the y as you vary is this energy surface line that you have. For the same x, if you vary y, I think you can get that from this picture. So that is what your loss function ultimately depends on, right? These two things. RW is a regularizer, okay. And then you take 1 by p as a mean of all the samples, since p is the number of samples that you have. So designing a good loss function, push down on the energy of the correct answer, makes sense. Push up on the energies of the incorrect answer, particularly if they are smaller than the correct one. Again, that makes sense. If your energy is smaller than the energy at the actual data point, you want to push the energy up at that place. So yeah, these are examples of loss function. So a very simple basic loss function that you can have is simply the energy loss. So this is the simplest loss function that you can have. So what it says is just take the energy at the data point yi xi, since that is what we want to minimize. But the problem here is you are just trying to reduce the loss at the data point, but you're not trying to increase the loss at other places. You are just doing you are just doing half of the job. The loss function simply pushes down on the energy of the correct answer. If the network is not designed properly, it might end up with a mostly flat energy function, which makes sense, right? Since if you're just pushing down on the data point, it might just push down at all places. So you might end up with a flat energy function, as you're only trying to make the energy of the correct answer small, but you're not pushing up the energy elsewhere. Thus, the system might collapse. Which makes sense. But I think Jan mentioned that there are still certain places where this simple energy loss function works. Yeah, what he said was, I had written it somewhere. So there are certain cases when you can only have low energy at a single point, and you need to have high energy. I mean, you automatically have high energy elsewhere. I mean, there may be certain architectures where it's like that. I don't know. So in certain cases, this simple energy loss works. And he also says that it is used in self-supervised learning. Okay. Yeah, I think this one makes total sense. It's a simplest loss function that you can have when you are having an energy based model. So next you move to negative log likelihood loss. So this one pushes down on the energy of the correct answer, and it also does the other thing, which is push up on the energies of all the other answers in proportion to their probabilities. It has been used in long time for communities for discriminative training with structured outputs. Okay, so if you look at this formula, this part is the same as this. So you want to minimize the energy at the data point at the correct y, and then you want to minimize it for all other y's. So you integrate over all y's. I think this formula is wrong. There should be a negative here. Yep, there's a negative at this place if we can see. So you are trying to yeah, since this negative is ensuring that the loss will be high if your energies at other y's are low. Yeah, so basically it pushes down on the energy at the data points and pushes up the energy at all other y's. Yes, okay. Probability model is an EBM in which the energy can be integrated over y. Okay, the loss function is the negative log likelihood. Okay. Yeah, I think this makes intuitive sense. It just goes a step ahead of the simple energy loss that we saw here. Next is the perceptron loss. This is similar to the perceptron loss from 60 plus years ago. Okay. Okay, so what this one tries to do is so this part is the same as what we saw here. So this is the energy at the correct y, and you subtract from it the minimum energy from all possible y's. So yeah, so essentially it tries to make sure that the energy at the correct y is the lowest. Yeah, I think this makes sense. So this can never be negative because I mean the lowest it can go is 0, right? Because if this becomes the minimum one, that will be say equal to this, so it will become 0. The same computation shows that it gives exactly 0 when yi is the correct answer. Okay, so one a disadvantage of this is that it might lead to the model giving the same energy to all the points. So basically a flat function. So even if you have a totally flat function, the loss will be 0. So this is not a great loss function. So how do you improve this loss? So to improve this loss, you consider something called the most offending incorrect answer. Um, the most offending incorrect answer is basically the answer for other y values for which the energy is the lowest. So if y is a discrete variable and then your training sample is xi, yi, the most offending incorrect answer is that y for which the answer is the lowest energy amongst all possible answers that are incorrect. So yi is the argument of y for which the energy is, I mean, yeah, it's the argument of the energy with y as the parameter. And for incorrect answers, I mean, sorry, for continuous variables, it's something similar. The y for which the energy is the lowest, but then for continuous variables, uh, yeah, you have a small constant that is at least lambda, I mean, epsilon away from the correct answer. Yeah, this is again reiterating the same thing. In the discrete case, the most offending incorrect answer is the one with the smallest energy that is in the correct answer. In the continuous case, the energy for y extremely close to yi should be close to E. Furthermore, the argument as a result we pick a distance. Okay, what he's saying is for something that is really close to the data point, the energy would still be low. We don't want to push that up, so that's why we pick something that's a distance epsilon away from the actual data point. So so now we come to the good example, I mean good losses for energy based models. So this is hinge loss. So in hinge loss, so for all of these losses that we see after from now on, these are losses that take the most offending incorrect answer. This concept is used in all of these losses, and you have a margin as well. So this, yeah, this is it's self-explanatory here. This loss enforces that the difference between the correct answer and the most offending incorrect answer to be at least m. Yep, that makes sense, right? So you want the energy at the data point to be at least m lower than the lowest energy at of the most offending. I mean, the loss is, yeah, it should be lower than the most offending incorrect answer, the energy of the most offending incorrect answer. So the loss is 0 when this energy is m lower than the lowest one. M is arbitrary, but it affects the weight of the last layer. Okay. Log loss is similar to that. It can be thought of as a soft hinge loss. So here, what he says is it tries to enforce an infinite margin. Instead of composing the difference of the correct answer and the most offending incorrect answer with a hinge, it is now composed with a soft hinge. Okay. Yep, it makes sense, right? So if this energy is higher than this energy, your loss is high. So it tries to enforce an infinite margin. Okay. Square loss is the same thing, but you just take squares. This loss combines the square of the energy with the square hinge. So take square of the energy at the correct y and square of this part. Yep. This combination tries to minimize energy and this is very similar to the laws used in Siamese nets. Okay. So these are a summary of all the loss functions. So this says if there is a margin involved in those or not. So energy loss and perceptron loss, as we've already seen, are not that good. So the good losses are ones that use this concept of most offending incorrect answer and a margin. That's what he says in the lecture. So if it uses both of those, then it's a good loss for an energy function. Yep. And as I had said before, the simple energy loss does not do anything to push up the energy at other points, and it does not have a margin. So it's not that good. And the perceptron loss, it works when you have a linear parameterization of your energy. So if you don't have any non-linearity in your model, I guess it does work. How is the most offending incorrect answer found in the continuous case? So like, yeah, we have discussed this earlier. So we want, if you take a yi that is close to the correct yi, you don't want to push that up because it's too close to the correct point. So it's the energy there would have to be still low. And your neural net might, it might become stiff. This is hard. This is a problem that this is the problem that methods selecting contrastive samples try to solve. Yep. Yeah, so what this is doing is just selecting contrastive samples to push up, and there is no single correct way to do it. Okay. This is a general form for hinge type contrastive losses. Okay, so this one, the difference is it does not just take the most offending one, it takes it it does a summation over all y's. So this is for discrete. Yeah, it does a summation over all the y's and tries to push up the energies at other places. E minus EW. So this y is the generic y value for all y's, is the difference of E evaluated at the correct answer and some other answer. And yeah, the margin is also not a constant. The margin depends on the distance. It's a distance measure between the y under consideration and the actual y, which makes sense because the amount we want to push up on an incorrect sample y should depend on the distance between y and the correct sample yi. So if something is close, we don't want to push it as much as something that is much far away from the data point. So those ones, your margin, you want it to be higher, thus ensuring that the energy there is also higher. So this is the general form of hinge loss, where the difference is you don't just take the most offending y, you take all y's. You do a summation over y's in the discrete case. This can be more difficult loss to optimize, which makes sense. Yes, I think we are done. Uh, I've not done much of the practicums in the earlier lectures, but did he? Is there any notebook where he uses any energy based? Has he used any energy based loss functions or anything like that in the previous practicums? Does anyone know?
I don't think so. I haven't, I've gone through some of them at least, but none of them I've seen anything more complex than ReLU. And, I think MSc loss is most of the time I've seen in.
Yeah, I mean, it's one thing learning all these, but yeah, it would be nice to actually implement some of these. Okay. Are there any questions? By the way, we don't have host for the next one. If anyone is interested, please do volunteer. I probably won't be able to do it because I'm kind of busy the next week. This is the thing. I think this is talking about world models and all. Yeah, if you're interested, please do volunteer. Yep. Are there any questions? Okay. If there are no questions, we can end the call. Thanks everyone. Thanks for joining.
Thanks, guys. Take care.
Did I miss any chat? Okay, I'll just paste these chats in the Slack.
Yes.
Sujit, did you want to discuss anything? I saw that you posted a few. I did not have a chance to look at those about the custom activation functions. I mean, is there anything interesting that you noticed in those?
I think it dropped, Gautam.
Oh, okay, that's fine. Okay, thanks everyone for joining. Thank you. Bye bye.